I am 83 years old, and last week my daughter called me and said, "Mom, we need to talk about your living situation." And if you have ever heard those words before, you already know they are not a question. They are the beginning of a decision that someone else has been quietly making for you. I knew what she meant before she even explained it, because I had seen the way she looked at me lately. The way her eyes followed me when I stood up from a chair, or when I paused just a second too long at the top of the stairs, as if she was measuring something I could not see, something I was not ready to admit. And I remember sitting there in my living room, holding the phone, staring at the same walls that had held my life together for decades, and realizing something that unsettled me more than the idea of falling, more than the idea of getting sick. I realized that my life was slowly being evaluated, and I was no longer the one in control of what happened next. My name is Margaret, and I am going to tell you something most people my age will never say out loud, not because it is not true, but because it is uncomfortable. If you reach a point where you can no longer live the way you used to, do not rush into the solutions people offer you, because I tried them, all of them. I tried living with family. I tried hiring help. I even tried moving into a place where everything was supposed to be safe and taken care of. And I am telling you right now, some of those choices will take more from you than they give, and you will not realize it until you are already inside them. If you are younger, you might be thinking about your parents, wondering what is best for them. And if you are older like me, you are probably thinking quietly about what will happen when your body starts to change in ways you cannot control. Either way, I want you to listen carefully, because what I am about to share is not theory. It is not advice from someone looking in from the outside. It is something I lived through, step by step, mistake by mistake, until I found myself standing at a point where I almost lost the last thing that still felt like mine, my independence. And the truth is, losing independence does not happen all at once. It does not come with a single moment that you can clearly point to. It happens slowly, in small decisions, in compromises that seem reasonable at the time, in choices made out of fear rather than clarity. And before you realize it, you wake up in a life that no longer feels like your own. And that is exactly where I was heading, without even knowing it, until one moment made me stop and ask myself a question I had been avoiding for far too long. Am I still living my life, or am I slowly giving it away piece by piece? For most of my life, I was never alone, and that is important for you to understand, because people like to talk about old age as if it begins the day your hair turns white or your hands begin to shake. But for me, old age began the day my husband died, because before that, I was part of a pair, part of a rhythm, part of a life that felt steady and deeply familiar. I married Richard when I was 21 years old, and we built everything together from almost nothing, a modest house, 2 children, ordinary routines that became the structure of our world. And if you had looked at our life from the outside, you might have called it simple, but to me it felt full, because love is not only in grand gestures. It is in the thousand small things that repeat over decades until they become the shape of your existence. It is in knowing how someone clears their throat before they speak, in hearing their footsteps in the hallway, and knowing exactly who it is without looking, in pouring 2 cups of coffee every morning without needing to ask if the other person wants one. Richard was steady in all the ways that mattered. Not dramatic, not overly sentimental, but reliable, present, the kind of man who fixed what broke and showed up when needed. And after 46 years with someone like that, you stop thinking in terms of me and start thinking in terms of us. Our house, our plans, our children, our savings, our habits, our future. And I believed, foolishly perhaps, that because we had made it through hard seasons before, that future would simply keep going in the same direction, maybe slower, maybe quieter, but still together. And then one Tuesday morning, that future ended. Richard died so quickly that my mind rejected it before my heart could even begin to understand it. One moment, I was still his wife, still part of a shared life. And the next, I was standing in a hospital hallway holding a paper bag of his belongings, his watch, his wallet, his wedding ring, small objects that suddenly felt too light to represent a whole man, a whole marriage, a whole life. And after the funeral, after the sympathy cards, after the casseroles and flowers and kind expressions that people bring when death is still fresh enough to be socially visible, everything went quiet. And that is the part no one prepares you for, not the loss itself, but the silence that comes after. The way the world goes back to normal while your own life has been split into before and after. I would wake up in the morning and reach instinctively toward the other side of the bed before remembering. I would start to say something out loud and realize there was no one there to hear it. I would set 2 plates out of habit and then stand in the kitchen staring at them as if my hands had made a mistake my heart could not correct. And yet, even then, I told myself I was fine. Because that is what women like me do. We manage, we carry on, we keep the house running. We pay the bills. We say we are doing all right even when what we mean is that we have not completely fallen apart in front of other people. And for a while, I truly believed I could handle it. I could cook, I could clean, I could sort the mail, I could keep appointments, I could smile when my children called and say I was adjusting. But capability can hide a great deal, and what no one saw, not even me at first, was that underneath all that competence something fundamental had changed, not only because Richard was gone, but because the life that had given structure to my days was gone with him. And once that happens, even ordinary tasks begin to feel different, not impossible, but heavier, quieter, more exposed, as if every chore is now carrying the weight of absence along with it. And still I told myself that time would fix it, that grief would soften, that routine would return, that I would find a new shape for my life and settle into it. But what actually happened was much subtler and much more dangerous, because the loneliness did not arrive like a storm. It arrived like dust, settling slowly over everything until one day I looked around and realized that what I had been calling adjustment was really the beginning of decline. Not dramatic decline, not the kind that sends you to the hospital, but the kind that enters quietly through the side door, through fatigue, forgetfulness, hesitation, and small moments of uncertainty. And by the time I understood that, I was already further into it than I wanted to admit. The moment everything shifted did not happen in a hospital or in front of other people. It happened quietly, in my own bathroom, on a morning that felt no different than any other. I had taken a shower, the water still warm in the air, the mirror slightly fogged, and I stepped out onto the mat the same way I had done thousands of times before, without thinking, without hesitation, because when something becomes routine, you stop respecting how easily it can go wrong. And that was when my foot slipped. Not completely, not enough to send me crashing to the floor, but just enough for my body to lose its balance for a fraction of a second. And in that fraction of a second, something inside me reacted before I could think. My hand shot out and grabbed the metal bar on the wall, gripping it harder than I had ever held on to anything in my life. And I froze there, heart pounding, breath caught somewhere between panic and disbelief. Because I realized how close I had come, not to falling, but to something much worse, the realization that I could fall. And that realization does not leave you once it arrives. It settles into your mind and begins to change the way you move, the way you think, the way you exist in your own space. I stood there longer than I needed to, just holding that bar, staring at the floor as if it had betrayed me. Even though nothing about it had changed, it was still the same tile, the same distance, the same bathroom I had trusted for years, but I was not the same, and that difference is what frightened me, not the slip itself, but the understanding that my body was no longer something I could rely on without question, that it could fail me in small, unpredictable ways, and that next time, there might not be a bar within reach, that next time, I might not catch myself, and what happens after that? That is where the fear truly begins, because it is not just about the fall. It is about what comes after the fall, lying there, unable to get up, waiting, hoping someone notices, wondering how long it would take before anyone realizes something is wrong. And that night, when I went to bed, I could not stop thinking about it. The image replayed in my mind over and over, not dramatically, but persistently, like a quiet warning I could not ignore. And for the first time since Richard died, my home did not feel like a place of comfort. It felt like a place of risk, a place where something could happen and no one would know. And that thought stayed with me long enough to turn into a decision, not a big decision, not one that felt final, just a small step toward what I believed would be safety. I picked up the phone and called my daughter, and when she answered, I tried to sound casual, tried to keep my voice steady, as if I was asking for something temporary. Something simple, I said. Maybe I could come stay with you for a little while, just until I feel steadier. And she said yes immediately. Of course she did, because she loves me, because she is a good daughter. And in that moment, I felt relief, real relief, the kind that makes you believe you have found the right solution, that everything will be easier now, that the fear will fade once you are not alone anymore. But what I did not understand then, what I could not have understood yet, was that I was not just asking for help. I was taking the first step into a different kind of life, one where the line between being cared for and losing control becomes harder to see. And once you cross that line, even gently, even with the best intentions, it can be very difficult to find your way back. Moving into my daughter's house felt like relief for the first few days, and I want to be honest about that. Because when people tell these stories later, they often skip over the part where it almost seems like the right decision. But at first it did. I slept better knowing there were other people in the house. I did not listen for every sound at night. I did not worry as much about what would happen if I slipped again. And there was comfort in hearing normal life around me, the grandchildren laughing in the next room, the television on downstairs, my daughter moving through the kitchen in the morning while coffee brewed. For a little while it even felt warm, as if grief had loosened its grip and I had stepped back into something familiar. Family dinners returned, conversations stretched a little longer, and my daughter seemed happy to have me there. She would ask if I needed anything. My son-in-law was polite and kind. The children asked me questions about when their mother was young, and I remember thinking that maybe this was what people meant when they said growing older was about letting family take care of you. Maybe I had fought the idea for too long. Maybe this was simply the next stage of life. But comfort has a way of changing once routine settles in. And routine is where truth begins to show itself. Because after that first week, everyone returned to their normal schedules. My daughter and her husband worked long hours. The children had school, sports, friends, homework, their own small busy worlds. And slowly I began to understand that I had not stepped into a shared life. I had stepped into someone else's already moving life. One that did not stop or reshape itself just because I was now inside it. During the day, I was alone most of the time, just as I had been in my own house, except now I was alone in someone else's space. And there is a very different feeling to that. In your own home, solitude can still feel like ownership, but in another person's home, solitude feels like waiting. I became careful in ways I had never been before, careful about where I sat, how loudly I closed a cabinet, how long I stayed in the kitchen, how much water I used, even how early I turned on the television, because none of it was fully mine anymore. And then the small corrections began, never cruel, never harsh, just small remarks that sound harmless by themselves but begin to add up when they happen every day. Mom, maybe less salt. Your blood pressure. Mom, could you turn that down? The kids are studying. Mom, we are going out Saturday. You will be okay here alone for a few hours, right? And every time I smiled and said of course, because I knew they were not trying to hurt me. They were simply living their lives. But that was exactly the problem. They were living their lives and I was adjusting mine around theirs. I was not a mother in that house anymore. Not really. I was a presence to be considered, a schedule to work around, a responsibility to keep in mind. And once I began to feel that, I could not stop feeling it. The moment that made it impossible to ignore came one evening when I passed the hallway and heard my daughter on the phone with her sister. Her voice was low, tired, the kind of tired she would never show me directly. And she said, I know it is the right thing to do, but honestly, it is exhausting. I cannot even go to the store without worrying about her. And she was not being cruel. She was telling the truth. But truth can wound even when spoken with love. I stood there for a second, completely still, and felt something inside me change, because in that moment I understood that I had crossed a line I never wanted to cross. I was no longer simply her mother. I had become her burden to manage, and children can love you deeply and still feel burdened by you. Both things can be true at the same time. That night I sat on the edge of the bed in the guest room and looked around at the suitcase still partly unpacked, the framed family photo on the dresser, the soft lamp in the corner, and I felt more lonely than I had in my own house, because loneliness in your own home at least belongs to you. But loneliness inside a full house feels like disappearing in plain sight. And that was when I first began to think that safety, if it costs too much dignity, may not feel like safety at all. When I returned to my own house, the first thing I felt was relief, real relief, the kind that settles into your chest when you realize you are back in a place where everything belongs to you again, where every chair, every cabinet, Every small detail reflects your habits and your history. And for a few days I allowed myself to believe that leaving my daughter's house had solved the problem, that I had simply needed my own space, my own rhythm, my own control. But the truth does not disappear just because you step away from it. And very quickly I began to feel the same limitations that had led me to leave in the first place. The stairs still felt steeper than I remembered. Standing too long in the kitchen made my legs ache. And even simple tasks like carrying groceries or reaching for something on a high shelf required more effort than they once had. And it became clear that independence, while comforting, was no longer effortless. So I turned to the next solution that people always suggest: hiring help, someone to come in a few times a week, take care of the heavier tasks, make life easier without taking away my space. And at first it seemed like the perfect balance. The first woman who came was named Patricia. She was efficient, organized, and kind in a professional way that made everything feel smooth and manageable. She cleaned, she cooked, she helped with errands. And for a short time, I felt something I had not felt in months. I felt like I was keeping up with my own life again. But what no one tells you is that help changes the environment in ways you do not expect. Because even when someone is there to support you, they also bring their own systems, their own habits, their own way of doing things, and slowly, without realizing it, I found myself adjusting to her instead of the other way around. She folded towels differently. She left dishes to soak longer than I preferred. She reorganized parts of my kitchen to make things more efficient for her. And none of it was wrong, but none of it was mine, and that difference began to matter more than I expected. I would walk into my own kitchen and hesitate for a moment, as if I needed to remember where things were, and that small hesitation carried a larger meaning. I was no longer fully in control of my own space. And at the same time, the financial reality began to settle in. The bills arrived steadily. $3,000 a month for part-time help. And while I had savings, I could see the pattern clearly. Month after month, the numbers would go down, slowly but consistently. And I began to understand that this was not something I could sustain forever. It was not just a short-term solution. It was a path that would eventually lead to another kind of dependence. And then there was the instability. Patricia had to leave due to a family emergency, and suddenly I was starting over, explaining everything again to someone new, where things were kept, how I preferred things done, what I needed help with, and then another person, and another, each one different, each one requiring energy I did not have to spare. And with each change, I felt less settled, less secure, more like my life was being managed in pieces by people who came and went. And that was when I realized something that no one had explained clearly before. Hiring help does not just cost money. It costs energy, it costs consistency, and it can slowly take away the sense that your home is truly yours. In one afternoon, sitting alone at my kitchen table with a stack of bills in front of me, I looked around and saw a house that was clean, organized, and functioning, but did not feel entirely like mine anymore. And I asked myself a question that was difficult but necessary. If I am paying this much and still feeling this uncertain, is this really helping me? Or is it simply delaying a problem I have not yet solved? When my daughter suggested the facility, she presented it carefully, almost gently, as if the way she described it could soften what it really meant. She had done her research. She told me it was clean, well managed, staffed with professionals, a place where I would be safe, where I would not have to worry about stairs or cooking or what might happen if I fell. And she asked me to try it for 1 month, just one, not as a final decision, but as an experiment. And by that point I was tired of trying to solve everything on my own, tired of weighing options that all seemed to take something from me. So I agreed, not because I believed it was right, but because I did not know what else to do. The day I moved in felt strangely neutral, not emotional the way I had expected, but quiet, almost procedural. Like checking into a place that was meant to take over responsibilities I had carried for decades. The room was small but clean, everything arranged neatly: a bed, a chair, a dresser, a window that looked out onto a courtyard where other residents sat in the afternoon sun. And at first I told myself I could adjust, that comfort might grow over time. The first few days were not unpleasant. I met other people. We sat together at meals. We played cards. We shared small pieces of our stories. And there was something reassuring about being surrounded by others who understood, at least in part, what it meant to be at this stage of life. But then the structure of the place began to reveal itself more clearly. And structure, I learned, is not the same as support. The days followed a strict schedule. Wake up at 6:30, breakfast at 7:30, lunch at noon, dinner at 5. And that might sound reasonable to someone from the outside, but when you have lived your entire life making your own choices, even something as simple as being told when to eat begins to feel like a loss. I had never eaten dinner at 5 in my life. But here, that was the only time food was served. And if you missed it, you waited. Evenings were quiet in a way that felt controlled. Lights dimmed early. Staff walked the halls, checking doors, reminding people of bedtime. And one night, when I kept my light on a little later than usual, there was a soft knock, a voice from the other side, saying, "It is time to sleep now." And I remember sitting there, looking at that light, and thinking, I have lived 8 decades making my own decisions. And now someone is telling me when to go to bed, not out of cruelty, not out of disrespect, but out of policy. And that word became something I heard often: policy, safety policy, routine policy, guidelines for residents. And each time it was said, it carried the same message: your choices are no longer entirely your own. One evening, I wanted to step outside. The air looked cool, the sky clear, and I walked toward the door without thinking, only to be stopped gently but firmly. Outdoor hours ended at 7, safety policy. And I stood there for a moment, looking at a door I was not allowed to walk through. And something inside me resisted that more than I expected, because it was not about the walk. It was about the permission, the idea that I needed approval to do something I had done freely my entire life. And over the following days, that feeling grew, not dramatically, not in a way that anyone else would have noticed, but steadily, like pressure building in a place you cannot easily reach. I met a woman named Helen. She was sharp, observant, and she told me something one afternoon that stayed with me long after I left. She said, "They do not take your freedom all at once. They take it in small pieces, so small you almost agree to it." And I realized she was right, because none of the rules felt unreasonable by themselves. Each one could be explained, justified, even defended. But together they created a life that no longer felt like mine. It was safe. It was structured. It was predictable, but it was not free. And the hardest part to admit was that I was not even that unwell. I could still think clearly, still walk, still take care of many things on my own. And yet I was living in a place designed for people who had already given up those abilities. And that realization settled into me until it became impossible to ignore. After 3 weeks, I called my daughter and told her I was leaving. She reminded me that I had agreed to a month, that it was for my safety, that I needed to give it more time. But I told her something I had only just understood myself. I said, "This is not living. This is waiting." And when I walked out of that building, stepping into the open air without asking anyone's permission, I felt something I had not felt in weeks. Not just relief, but clarity, because I finally understood that comfort, if it comes at the cost of your freedom, can begin to feel like a cage. When I returned home again, the house greeted me the same way it always had: quiet, familiar, unchanged. But I was not the same person who had left it, because now I carried something I had not carried before: the knowledge that none of the obvious solutions had worked, not living with family, not hiring help, not moving into a place designed to keep me safe. Each path had offered something, but each had taken something in return, and what they had taken mattered more than I expected. So for the first time, I stopped trying to fix the situation immediately. I did not make calls. I did not search for alternatives. I simply sat, day after day, in my living room by the window, watching the street as it moved on without me. People walked past. Cars came and went. Neighbors continued their routines. And I felt as if I was standing still while everything else continued forward. And in that stillness, a different kind of thought began to form. Not panic, not urgency, but a quieter, more unsettling question: what if there is no solution that truly fits? What if growing older is not about finding the right option, but about choosing which part of your life you are willing to lose? And I did not like that question. I resisted it, because it felt like giving up before I had exhausted every possibility. But the longer I sat with it, the more I realized that this is where many people stop, not because they want to, but because they run out of energy to keep searching. And I could feel that happening to me, a kind of slow exhaustion, not physical, but emotional, the kind that makes decisions feel heavier than they should be. I would look at the stairs and think about the effort, I would think about cooking and feel the weight of it before even beginning. I would consider calling for help and feel the frustration of starting over with someone new. And at night, the fear returned, not as sharp as before, but present, a quiet awareness that something could happen and I would be alone again. And there was one evening in particular that stays with me. I was standing in the kitchen trying to change a light bulb, something I had done countless times before, but my hands would not stay steady. They trembled just enough to make the task difficult. And after a few minutes of trying, I stopped, not because I could not continue, but because I suddenly saw what that moment represented. It was not about the light bulb. It was about the accumulation of small limitations, the kind that build quietly until they begin to define what you can and cannot do. And I stood there holding that bulb, feeling something I had not allowed myself to feel fully before, not fear, not frustration, but the possibility that I might eventually lose more than I was willing to accept. And that realization forced me to confront something I had been avoiding. I could not continue pretending that independence alone would carry me forward, but I also could not accept a life where I lost control of myself entirely. And for a few days after that, I did very little. I sat by the window again, watching, thinking, not looking for answers, but waiting. And sometimes waiting is not about giving up. It is about allowing space for something new to appear, something you were not actively searching for. And that is exactly what happened, not through a plan, not through a decision, but through something small, almost accidental, the kind of moment that does not feel important when it begins, but ends up changing everything. It did not begin as a plan or even as a solution. It began as a simple moment, the kind that most people would pass without thinking twice about. I was walking to the small grocery store a few blocks from my house, the one close enough that I could manage on my own, moving at my own pace, stopping when I needed to. And as I passed my neighbor Sarah, I noticed something in her that I had seen before, but never truly paused to consider. She was standing near her car, phone pressed to her ear, her voice tight with stress, pacing back and forth in a way that made it clear she was trying to solve a problem she did not have the time or space to solve. I could hear fragments of her conversation, words like work, timing, school, and when she hung up, she stood still for a moment as if the weight of everything had settled all at once, and without planning to, without thinking through whether it was appropriate or necessary, I walked over to her and said something simple, something that felt almost too small to matter. I said, "If you ever need someone to pick up your daughter from school, I pass by there." Anyway, she looked at me with a kind of surprise that made me realize how rarely people offer help without being asked. She hesitated, as if she did not want to impose, and I understood that feeling, so I said it again, more clearly this time. "You are not asking, I am offering." The next day, I picked up her daughter, Emma, walked her home, listened to her talk about her day in the way children do, full of small details that seem insignificant but carry so much energy. And when Sarah came home that evening, she knocked on my door with a plate of food. She said she had made extra and wanted me to have some. I tried to refuse out of habit, but she insisted, and that small exchange became something more, not immediately, not in a way that felt formal or defined, but gradually. Over the following days and weeks, I picked up Emma regularly, not because I had to, but because I could, and in return, Sarah helped me in ways that did not feel like charity. She showed me how to handle certain things online so I did not have to manage everything physically. Her husband fixed things around my house that I had been putting off, small repairs that made daily life easier, and Emma, without even knowing it, brought something back into my home that had been missing for a long time: noise, laughter, movement. And with all of that came something I had not realized I needed as much as I did, a sense of usefulness, because for months, I had been trying to solve the problem of needing help, but what I had not understood was that I also needed to feel like I still had something to give, and this arrangement, if you can even call it that, created something different from anything I had tried before. It was not dependence, and it was not complete independence. It was something in between, something balanced, where value moved in both directions. I gave what I could: time, presence, attention, and in return I received support, assistance, connection, and for the first time in a long while, I did not feel like a burden. I did not feel like a problem to be managed. I felt like a person who still mattered, and that feeling, I realized, was just as important as safety. What I understand now, after everything I tried and everything that did not work the way I expected, is that the choices we are given are often too simple for the reality we are living. People speak as if there are only two paths when you grow older. Either you remain completely independent or you become dependent on others. Either you stay alone or you are taken care of. But what I discovered is that there is a space in between those extremes, a space that is not talked about enough, a space where you can accept help without giving up control, where you can contribute without exhausting yourself, where your life is not reduced to being managed, but continues to have meaning. And meaning, I have learned, is not something that can be provided to you by a system or a service. It is something that comes from being connected, from being needed in some way, from knowing that your presence still has value. I spent thousands of dollars trying to solve the practical problems of living alone. I try to make my life easier, safer, more efficient, but none of those things addressed the deeper issue, which was not just how to live, but how to live in a way that still felt like my own life. Because safety without purpose begins to feel empty, and comfort without choice begins to feel restrictive. And what changed everything for me was not a program or a facility or a professional service. It was a simple relationship, a connection that allowed me to both receive and give at the same time. And that balance is what made it work. I am still 83. I still have limitations. I still get tired. I still move more carefully than I once did. But I am not waiting for my life to become smaller. I am still living it in a way that allows me to remain myself. And maybe one day things will be different. Maybe I will need more help than this arrangement can provide. And when that day comes, I will face it honestly. But it is not here yet. And until it arrives, I choose to live in a way that keeps me connected, keeps me involved, keeps me present in my own life. And if there is one thing I want you to take from my story, whether you are my age or thinking about someone who is, it is this: do not rush into solutions just because they are common or convenient. Do not assume that what works for one person will work for another. And most importantly, do not accept a version of life that takes away your sense of self in exchange for comfort. Because growing older does not mean becoming invisible. It does not mean losing your place in the world. It simply means that the way you belong may need to change. And sometimes, the answer is not found in institutions or services, but in the people around you. The ones who are also looking for connection, for support, for meaning, just like you. And when you find that, even in the smallest way, you realize something that changes everything. You are not just being taken care of, you are still living.